Life in the Middle Ages was far harsher than you might imagine. Modern conveniences have made us weak, and what people back then faced daily would surely astonish you. Imagine being there, amidst challenges that even a single day would be hard to overcome. From meager meals to terrible sanitary conditions, everything was a test of survival. Forget the romantic scenes in movies. The brutal reality will quickly bring you back to the 21st century. Life in the Middle Ages, often romanticized in books and films, was in reality a continuous series of harsh challenges that modern humans would find difficult to imagine. Among these, cuisine was one of the most terrifying aspects, a stark contrast to the images of opulent, elaborate feasts we often see on screen. For the majority of the populace, meals were not merely bland and monotonous, but also fraught with countless dangers, directly threatening health and life. First, one must dispel the illusion of the medieval feast, with giant turkey legs or intricately prepared, visually appealing dishes. The reality was far more brutal. Such grand feasts, if they existed, were reserved exclusively for the nobility, royalty, and the extremely wealthy on special occasions. As for ordinary people, meaning the vast majority of peasants, artisans, and laborers, their daily meals were a monotonous struggle for survival. Their diet was so simple it was as boring as watching paint dry, revolving around a few basic items, lacking diversity and nutrition. The staple food for peasants was pottage, a watery, bland soup that would be a nightmare for anyone accustomed to modern cuisine. Pottage was not the flavorful, nutritious soup we know. It was a thin, mushy concoction cooked from any vegetables they could grow, typically beans, oats, cabbage, and sometimes a bit of grain. What's more frightening is that pottage was often cooked in the same pot, continuously, day after day. It was like a medieval mother's mystery stew. But instead of hiding vegetables for the children to eat, it hid weevils and dirt. Yes, you heard that right. The hygiene standards in food preparation and preservation were extremely poor, making uninvited guests, like insects or grit, a familiar part of their daily meals. The image of steaming pottage in a grimy pot, emitting an indescribable odor, is enough to make anyone flee back to the 21st century, where convenient fast food chains abound. Besides pottage, bread was an essential staple, almost the main food for all social classes in medieval society. However, it was entirely different from the soft, fluffy, fragrant sliced bread we enjoy today. Medieval bread was typically dense, heavy, and dark in color. Even more horrifying, it often contained all sorts of unwanted additives. Flour was ground using crude stone mills, and during the milling process, small fragments of stone would often break off and mix into the flour. This meant that every bite of bread consumed by medieval people could contain tiny pieces of stone. Surprisingly, people of that era had stronger teeth, not because of good genetics or dental hygiene, but because they had to grind down that stony, mushy dough daily. The problems didn't stop there. A terrifying truth that few people know is that a significant portion of medieval bread could contain ergot, a fungus that grows parasitically on rye. Ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony's fire, caused horrific symptoms such as vivid hallucinations, a burning sensation throughout the body as if being consumed by fire, convulsions, and even death. Some historians even believe that ergot poisoning may have contributed to the witch hunt craze in some towns. Imagine an entire community simultaneously experiencing mass hallucinations from eating contaminated bread, and as a result, believing their neighbors were witches performing sinister rituals. Ironically, the problem wasn't magic, but the baker's failure to properly clean their equipment. The lack of effective food preservation methods was another horror. Meat, a luxury for the vast majority, was often consumed in a state of near rot due to the absence of refrigeration or chilling methods. To mask the unpleasant taste of spoiled meat, strong spices were used, but these spices were very expensive and not accessible to everyone. If you couldn't afford spices, your only option was to hold your nose and pray for the best when eating. The medieval 5-second rule, picking up food that falls on the ground within 5 seconds, would probably have to be extended to 5 days, as wasting food was unacceptable when life was already so difficult. The worst part is that you couldn't even drink water to wash down these terrible meals. Drinking water was a deadly hazard. Most water sources were contaminated by human waste and other disgusting things. Drinking well water or river water was the quickest way to get sick and die. Instead, everyone, including children, drank beer or ale. This beer was not as strong as modern beer, but the brewing process killed germs, making it safer than water. One study even indicated that an average medieval peasant consumed about 8 pints of beer per day. 5-year-old children also regularly drank beer with every meal. In the Middle Ages, children didn't need to fake IDs to drink alcohol. They needed to fake them to drink water. Fish was another common food, but it was usually preserved by drying or salting because fresh fish spoiled very quickly. For those living near the coast, having fresh fish was a blessing, but for those living inland, fish often reached them after many days or even weeks. Its smell alone was enough to make you faint. In summary, medieval meals were not just a forgettable culinary experience, but also a clear testament to the harshness and scarcity of life during that era. From weevil-infested bowls of pottage and loaves of bread containing stones and poisonous fungi, to rotten meat and contaminated drinking water, everything posed a potential danger. The romanticized image of the Middle Ages needs to be replaced with a more realistic portrayal of a relentless struggle for survival, where every meal was a challenge. Famine and food scarcity were an unavoidable part of the overarching harshness of life in the Middle Ages, and 3 key factors, the scarcity of fresh meat, contaminated water sources, and rudimentary fish preservation methods, shaped a risky and nutritionally deficient diet for the vast majority of the populace. Far from the lavish feasts often depicted in films, the culinary reality of this period was a struggle for survival, where every meal held inherent dangers and tested human endurance. Meat, especially fresh meat, was a luxury item that only the nobility, clergy, and the wealthy had the opportunity to enjoy regularly. For the majority of peasants and poor laborers, meat was a rare treat, appearing only on special occasions such as festivals, after a successful hunt, or when a domestic animal grew old and lost its working value. The biggest problem with meat in the Middle Ages was the complete absence of modern preservation methods like refrigeration. This meant that meat spoiled very quickly. Even if one managed to acquire a piece of meat, it was often almost rotten before it could be prepared and consumed. To cope with the unpleasant taste of spoiled meat, medieval people, if they could afford it, would use a large quantity of strong spices. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg not only provided new flavors, but also helped mask the foul odor and sour taste of the meat. However, spices were expensive imported goods, affordable only to wealthy families. For the poor, their only option was to hold their nose and pray for the best, hoping that consuming that spoiled meat wouldn't lead to illness or death. This illustrates the desperation and risk they faced just to obtain an essential protein source. If the issue of meat was horrifying enough, water sources were even more terrifying. In the Middle Ages, drinking water directly from natural sources like rivers, streams, or wells was an act of suicide. Most water sources were heavily contaminated by human and animal waste and other disgusting things. Underdeveloped or non-existent sanitation systems, combined with increasing urban population densities, turned rivers and underground springs into massive open sewers. Drinking contaminated water meant facing countless dangerous infectious diseases such as cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and many other ailments that could quickly lead to death. For this very reason, an alternative solution became widespread and widely accepted: beer and ale. Unlike modern strong beers, medieval beer had a much lower alcohol content, almost serving as an everyday beverage. Crucially, the brewing process, involving boiling the water and fermentation, helped kill most bacteria and pathogens present in the water. This made beer a much safer choice than plain water. Everyone, from children to adults, drank beer regularly. Some studies even indicate that an average medieval peasant could consume about 8 pints of beer per day, and children from 5 years old drank ale with every meal. In a world where water was a killer, beer became the essential water for survival, a strange and thought-provoking fact for modern society. Fish was also another important food source, especially on meatless days mandated by the church. However, like meat, fish also faced significant preservation challenges. Fresh fish spoiled very quickly, especially in humid climates and without rapid transportation. Therefore, most fish consumed in the Middle Ages was processed for preservation, primarily by drying or salting. While drying and salting extended the shelf life of fish, they significantly affected its quality and taste. Dried fish was often tough and needed to be rehydrated before cooking, while salted fish was extremely salty. It's worth noting that neither method could completely eliminate the fish's inherent pungent odor. In fact, they often intensified it. For those living near the coast, having fresh fish was a blessing, but for inland inhabitants, fish often reached them after several days or even weeks of transportation, already beginning to smell very unpleasant. The smell alone was enough to make you faint is not an exaggeration when referring to fish transported and preserved by medieval methods. In summary, the diet of medieval people was a vivid picture of scarcity, risk, and harshness. Fresh meat was a luxury, often spoiled. Drinking water was a source of disease, and fish, though common, was often ridden with unpleasant odors due to crude preservation methods. These conditions not only affected physical health, but also imposed a significant psychological burden. It reminds us that medieval life was far from a fairy tale romance, but rather a relentless struggle for survival amidst constant threats from the very things they ate and drank daily. When envisioning the Middle Ages, many often think of magnificent castles, valiant knights, or romantic tales. However, behind that veil of romanticization lies a stark reality of personal and public hygiene, an aspect that, if experienced for even a single day, would be enough to make any modern person shudder. Life in the Middle Ages was a symphony of foul odors, disease, and deprivation, where even the most basic necessities became formidable challenges. The nightmare of public hygiene, when streets became sewers. Let's begin with the most intractable problem: human waste management. In a world without modern sewage systems or flush toilets, going to the bathroom was a daily ordeal, and the result was streets teeming with countless pathogens. One, mobile restrooms, the chamber pot under the bed. For the majority of medieval people, the simplest concept of a toilet was the chamber pot, a bowl or bucket placed under the bed. This was the most convenient solution during the night or in harsh weather. However, this convenience lasted only until the pot was full. After that, waste disposal became a perplexing problem. People either carried it out themselves or waited for specialized individuals to collect it, a process few would want to contemplate. 2. Garde-à-l'eau, a warning before the shower of excrement. And then, the most horrifying part began. When the chamber pot was full, the most common way to get rid of the waste was to simply dump it out the window, down onto the street below. This image, seemingly only fit for dark comedy, was a daily reality in medieval towns and cities. To warn passers-by, people would often shout garde-à-l'eau, a variation of the old French phrase garde-à-l'eau, meaning beware of the water. However, the water here was a much more repulsive liquid. This practice was so widespread that in some medieval cities, there were even slightly more humane regulations. Waste was only allowed to be dumped out windows after 10 p.m. Nevertheless, this did not prevent the pungent stench from rising from the streets, which had been transformed into open sewers, where the waste of hundreds, even thousands, of people accumulated. 3. The garderobe, the nobility's toilet. Even the nobility in their sturdy castles could not escape the lack of sanitation. A garderobe was a simple toilet design, often a hole in a stone seat, that led directly to the castle wall or a pit below. Although seemingly more advanced than window dumping, the stench from these garderobes was still pervasive, especially within the confines of a drafty castle. Some archaeologists have even found a garderobe at Dover Castle that was almost 70 feet high. Even kings and queens, despite their magnificent thrones, had toilets that were essentially simple holes, devoid of any comfort or privacy. 4. Open sewers and gong farmers, unsung heroes. For those who couldn't wait to go home, public areas often had designated spots for personal needs, creating what we would now call open sewers. In London, a few public latrines were built over rivers, but they were very rare. The task of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to laborers with a less than glamorous title, gong farmers. These brave individuals were tasked with collecting waste from cesspits and transporting it out of the city. They were only allowed to work at night, and the stench clinging to them was so terrible that they were not allowed into public gatherings. Despite this, the work was quite lucrative, paying approximately 4 times more than a common laborer, indicating the difficulty and danger it entailed. 5. The unforgettable odor of medieval cities. The result of all these practices was that the stench in medieval cities became legendary. The streets reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, tannery chemicals, slaughterhouse remnants, and smoke from countless fires. With no waste collection system, garbage piled up in the streets or was simply thrown into rivers. Butcher shops dumped animal entrails and blood right outside their doors. The odor was so unbearable that people carried small bags filled with fragrant herbs, called pomanders, to hold under their noses to mask the terrible smell around them. Pomanders were essentially the medieval version of air freshener, but their function was merely to make a terrible smell slightly less terrible. Even the River Thames in London, now an icon of the city, was once so heavily polluted that it was described as a foul monster. 2. The struggle with personal hygiene and clothing. Beyond the filthy environment, personal hygiene for medieval people was another sad tale. 1. Bathing a few times a year. A harmful belief about water. The concept of personal hygiene was almost non-existent. The majority of people bathed only a few times a year, typically in spring and late summer. This was not only due to a lack of clean water and bathing facilities, but also a widespread and detrimental belief. People believed that bathing would open the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. In the winter months, it was completely normal not to bathe for 4 to 5 months. The consequences of poor hygiene were inevitable. Lice were so common that special combs to remove them were standard grooming tools in every household. In fact, it could be said that in medieval dating profiles, mild louse infestation might even have been considered a major plus. 2. Clothing. Uncomfortable, filthy, and worn to shreds. Medieval clothing did not help the situation. It was often made from coarse, uncomfortable materials, rarely washed, and usually worn until it fell apart. Undergarments were typically made of rough linen, causing skin irritation. Outerwear was often heavy wool, constantly causing itching. Whether rich or poor, most people owned a total of only 2 or 3 outfits. This meant they wore the same clothes for extended periods, making them filthy and smelly. Footwear was no better. Shoes were usually made of thin leather with flat soles, offering little protection from the weather or rough terrain. Walking on streets full of garbage and waste with such shoes must have been a horrifying experience. 3. No toilet paper, the improvised solution. And when it comes to hygiene, one cannot overlook something seemingly simple yet incredibly important: toilet paper. In the Middle Ages, toilet paper was an entirely alien concept. People used whatever was available: leaves, moss, grass, or even their left hand. If they were wealthier, they might use scraps of wool or hemp. Ironically, the ancient Romans had a far more advanced solution. They used a sponge on a stick, washed in vinegar or salt water for reuse. However, this knowledge of hygiene seems to have been largely lost in the Middle Ages. 3. The overall picture of daily life's harshness. Beyond sanitation issues, daily life in the Middle Ages encompassed countless other challenges, making each day a battle for survival. 1. Language barrier, a foreign language in your own land. Even the language barrier was a problem. Middle English from the 1400s sounded almost like a foreign language to modern English speakers. Common phrases from that era would leave you perplexed, and they would think you were talking nonsense. Communicating and integrating into society would be extremely difficult. The age of the Black Death and dark medicine. The struggle with disease in the Middle Ages. Within the comprehensive picture of the harshness of life in the Middle Ages, perhaps no aspect was more horrifying and tragic than the field of medicine and disease. It was an era where illness ravaged every corner. Medicine as we know it today was virtually non-existent, and what was called treatment often resembled torture more than healing. For medieval people, death was a familiar companion, constantly lurking and capable of snatching away life at any moment, even from a simple cold. The fragility of life, death lurking everywhere. In the Middle Ages, human life was incredibly fragile. A common cold or a simple flu, which today we can easily treat with rest and over-the-counter medicine, could then become a death sentence for the populace. The reasons were simple: a lack of understanding about the causes of disease, ineffective remedies, and a living environment teeming with pathogens. 1. Medieval WebMD. A simple diagnosis. If a medieval WebMD existed, it would probably have only one general diagnosis for every ailment. You will probably die. The lack of medical knowledge meant that physicians, if any, could not differentiate between various diseases, and every symptom led to a pessimistic outcome. This helplessness in the face of illness fostered a sense of resignation and despair within the community. 2. Flawed theories on the causes of disease. Without microscopes to see bacteria or viruses, medieval people relied on outdated and erroneous theories to explain the causes of disease. 2 of the most common beliefs were miasma theory. People believed that illness spread through bad air or noxious vapors rising from filthy areas, garbage, or decaying corpses. This was partly logical, as such polluted areas indeed bred disease vectors like rats and insects, but they misunderstood the mechanism of transmission. They tried to avoid foul odors by burning herbs or carrying pomanders, sachets of fragrant herbs, but these measures were completely ineffective against microscopic pathogens. 4. Humorous theory. This theory originated in ancient Greece, positing that the human body was composed of 4 main humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health was maintained when these 4 humors were in balance. When a person fell ill, it meant 1 or more humors were out of balance. This theory shaped most medical treatments throughout the Middle Ages, despite having no scientific basis whatsoever. 2. Treatments, more painful than healing. Based on these erroneous theories, medieval medical treatments often focused on restoring the balance of the humors, which in reality caused more pain and danger than healing. 1. Bloodletting, the solution for every ailment. Bloodletting was the most common treatment and was applied to almost every ailment, from fevers and headaches to severe infections. The idea behind it was that if a person was ill, they had too much blood, or bad blood, that needed to be removed from the body to restore the humoral balance. This process involved cutting a vein, usually in the arm or leg, with a sharp knife or specialized tool, and allowing the blood to drain into a bowl. The physician would estimate the amount of blood to be drawn based on the patient's condition, but often they acted purely on intuition. This method was not only ineffective but also weakened the patient's body, making them more susceptible to infection and severe blood loss, leading to death. A medieval physician would probably say, "You have too much blood. Let me adjust that for you," regardless of the illness. 2. Leeches, blood-sucking doctors. Besides bloodletting with a knife, leeches were another common tool in medieval medicine. These blood-sucking parasites were placed directly on the patient's skin to draw out bad blood. It was believed that this would remove harmful substances and restore balance within the body. Some medical texts of the time even recommended using enormous numbers of leeches, for example, 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. This was not only gruesome but also carried a serious risk of infection, especially when tools and the environment were not sanitized. 3. Herbal remedies and spiritual beliefs. Although methods like bloodletting and leeches predominated, herbal remedies were also widely used. However, knowledge of herbs was very rudimentary, and many plants used had no real medicinal effect, or were even poisonous. The preparation of medicines often relied on folk experience and spiritual belief rather than science. Furthermore, spiritual belief played an important role in healing. People often sought out churches, saints, or performed religious rituals to pray for recovery. This demonstrated their desperation in the face of an underdeveloped and risky medical system. 3. Horrific mortality rates, a struggle for survival. With crude treatment methods and unsanitary living conditions, mortality rates due to disease in the Middle Ages were extremely high, especially among children. 1. Child mortality and average life expectancy. Statistics show that approximately 30% of children died before the age of 5. This is a horrifying figure, reflecting the fragility of life from birth, where common infections, malnutrition, or birth complications could all claim the lives of infants. The average life expectancy for medieval people ranged only from 30 to 40 years. Very few lived to old age, and if they did, they had to endure countless illnesses and the wear and tear on their bodies from overwork and harsh living conditions. 2. The Black Death, a catastrophe that decimated a continent. The greatest and most terrifying medical catastrophe of the Middle Ages was the Black Death in the mid-14th century. In just a few years, roughly from 1347 to 1351, the plague claimed the lives of about 50% of Europe's population, equivalent to tens of millions of people. This was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The plague spread rapidly through fleas living on rats. The dirty, crowded, unsanitary living conditions in medieval cities created ideal conditions for rats and fleas to proliferate. People had no understanding whatsoever of the disease's transmission mechanism, leaving them utterly helpless and panicked. Crude treatment methods like bloodletting or herbal remedies were completely ineffective against this deadly disease. The devastation of the Black Death completely reshaped the social, economic, and religious landscape of Europe, leaving a deep scar on history. 4. Other health problems, from dental nightmares to poisonous remedies. Beyond infectious diseases and the plague, many other health problems contributed to the suffering and early death of medieval people. 1. Dental nightmare. Dental problems were a real nightmare. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or any concept of proper oral hygiene, tooth decay and gum disease were extremely common. People constantly suffered from terrible toothaches. Medieval dentists didn't need appointments. They simply waited until someone screamed loudly enough for the whole town to hear, and then used crude pliers to extract the tooth. This process involved no anesthesia or sanitation, causing extreme pain and a high risk of infection. After all that has been described about brutal warfare, harsh working conditions, severe lack of hygiene, and social and intellectual barriers, we can conclude that life in the Middle Ages was truly a daily struggle for survival. Every aspect was a challenge, from finding clean food and dealing with deadly diseases, to living under a brutal legal system and a society without privacy. As we reflect on this journey through the horrors of the Middle Ages, you will undoubtedly yearn to return to your comfortable modern life, with antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and even deodorant. The past may be romanticized in books and films, but the reality of life in the Middle Ages was a daily struggle for survival that very few modern people could endure, even for a single day. It is a valuable lesson about the worth of the conveniences we possess, about humanity's continuous progress, and about the importance of cherishing what we have achieved on our journey from darkness to light.